Good evening, everybody. Gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the WiTT's Trends in SpaceTech discussion. My name's Helen Tudor. I'm here with Sheffield Haworth. I was going to say we're over the moon to host you, but I'm trying to keep the puns to, if that's a pun, keep them limited. Delighted to host because Sheffield Haworth, we're an executive search, we're a talent advisory business, and we've developed a bit of a niche working with the investors and the space tech companies as they're scaling to help them with appointing their executive teams, directors for boards, etc. So hence where our interest comes from, and really looking forward to hearing everything this evening. I've got a few things just to inform you about so that we all know the space. So the emergency exit is at the back there, where Francis just pointed to. If for step-free access toilet facilities, these are just around this corner here, and other facilities are down there. We are doing some recording and taking pictures this evening, so if you could just let one of the team know if that's something you'd prefer to be kept out of, that would be great. Have I forgotten anything? No? I think that was everything. So I will pass over to our hosts. Thank you, Yasmeen.
Thanks very much, Helen, and it's great to be here at Sheffield Haworth. Good evening and welcome to Women in Technologies, Women in Telecoms and Technologies, or WiTT's first event of 2024. Thank you all for joining us this evening. A little introduction. My name is Yasmeen, and Yasmeen Majid, and I've been on the WiTT board for the last several years and attending the WiTT meetings for many years now. We have someone else from the WiTT board here with us, Audrey Mandela, who chairs the WiTT board. So, as you probably know, WiTT puts on about a half a dozen events such as this every year, different themes, panels, and I'll be going into detail on some of the other planning that we have for the rest of the year after the panel session. So, let's get started. I'm delighted to be here to explore this evening's topic, Trends in Space Tech, with our brilliant panel. The space sector is globally significant, and while relatively small in the UK, it's significant in terms of income, and that income is in the billions, and it's growing. We'll hear more on that shortly. In the UK, we play an important role in space exploration and participate in many elements of the value chain. We supply components for planetary orbiters, so satellites. We have 2 licensed spaceports, one in Cornwall, another one, the Saxavord off the Shetland Islands, and then we have a third in the Sutherland spaceport. And we actually have the Chief of Operations from Orbex here with us this evening. So maybe we'll have questions for her as well this evening. So we play a role in collecting and analyzing the data, applying that data to aid in further space research and to inform decision-making of companies, organizations here on Earth. The UK Space Agency reminds us that the UK has provided expertise and equipment to some of the most high-profile space missions of recent times. And government, of course, has made its contribution. So the UK is on the radar in the space sector. There's a lot of ground to cover. I was going to use an awful pun and say, or should I say, space to cover. And as we only have an hour, we're going to be hearing from 3 experts on their respective areas. After they've spoken, we're going to have some time for Q&A, so please give some thought to some good questions for the panel. I'd like to start out first by introducing Eloise Trimingham from know.space. It's a specialist space economics and strategy consultancy, and as a space economist, Eloise has carried out numerous projects across the space value chain for public organizations such as the UK Space Agency and the European Space Agency, as well as private actors. Eloise holds a BA in economics from Cambridge. Eloise, I believe you're going to set some context for us and talk about one of the recent reports that your organization has done.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's get started. Thanks, Yasmeen. So, I'm going to provide really an economic overview of the sector. So, what follows is going to be based on a report called Size and Health of the UK Space Industry. This report is commissioned by the UK Space Agency every year to provide these key stats like income, employment, how they're changing over time, and also some kind of softer statistics and thoughts on how the sector is evolving over time. So know.space, my company, were commissioned by the agency to carry out the 2022 report. This is the most recent published iteration. Sees the most up-to-date comprehensive statistics which exist on the economics of the space sector. So here's some headline numbers for you. I'll start with income. So total space industry income in 2020-21 is estimated to be 17.5 billion. This makes it a relatively small sector in the overall economy. The sector is based around about 1,600 organisations. These aren't all what we would think of as space organisations. Space might actually constitute a fairly small proportion of their overall activities, but they do have some significant space activities going on. The sector employs nearly 50,000 people directly, again, making it a fairly small sector overall. However, it's an extremely productive sector. So we see 2.5 times the average UK labour productivity. For reference, that's about 144,000 per employee. And this high productivity is also reflected in R&D intensity. So nearly 800 million R&D expenditure, 2020 to 2021. To put that in context, that's a lot higher than any other ONS official sector. We can also dive into the composition of the workforce a bit more. I guess particularly relevant for tonight, we see that 1 in 4 employees are female. It is an exceptionally productive sector in part because it's a very educated sector. So 3 in 4 employees have a primary degree or higher. Again, this is higher than any other official ONS sector. And then lastly for this slide, I want to dive a bit more into breaking income down. So what activities actually happen in the sector? So in the bottom left here, we divide the sector into 4 different segments. The first of those is space manufacturing, relatively small, accounts for 12% of overall sector income. Space manufacturing could refer to the manufacture of satellites, but also satellite components, scientific instruments going on board satellites. And we see like big players like Airbus in the UK, for example. The second segment we could look at is space operations. This accounts for about 9% of income. I think when we think space operations, we often think of launch. That is included in here. It's a relatively small part. There's a lot that goes into the space operations category. Thirdly, we have space applications. This is by far the largest subsegment of the UK space sector. And within this, the majority of income is associated with direct-to-home broadcasting, basically satellite TV, and a lot of that is associated with Sky. So it's a big proportion of the sector overall. There's also various other space applications, for example, applications of Earth observation or EO data. And then the final and smallest segment we call ancillary services. So that could be stuff like know.space's work and consultancy, but also insurance, legal advice, all those companies which are working to support the sector, other organisations. And just lastly, final stat on that slide, we see 5.1% income growth year on year up to 2020 to 2021. This is stronger than the global space industry and exceptional considering how the UK economy was doing at that time. Okay, so a second slide here, bombarding you with more statistics. So firstly, looking at exports, we see that there's 5.9 billion in exports in 2020 to 2021. Now, the space sector has quite a high export share when we look at it as a whole, but if we remove direct-to-home broadcasting or satellite TV, that actually gets much higher. It becomes an exceptionally high export share. And most of those exports are going to the rest of Europe, around 55%. There's also a significant role for North America and Asia and Oceania. In terms of investment, Science and Health captures one angle of investment into the space sector. So we only look at investment into UK headquartered companies. It's often very difficult to disentangle global investment. We see that in 2022, there were 34 investment deals accounting for about 635 million. And over the 10-year period going back, we see the 293 investment deals accounting for 11.7 billion. Over that time period, there's a lot of fluctuation. We often see that the kind of overall numbers are driven by a few mega deals, not included in our statistics for 2022. We have the massive Eutelsat OneWeb merger and the Inmarsat Viasat merger. On the right-hand side there, we have employment by region. We see significant dominance of London and the southeast, but Scotland also has a significant role to play, accounting for 18% of income. We see lots of new activity in Scotland, for example, with the launch sites, which Yasmeen mentioned. And then if we go down to the bottom row, we have GVA, or gross value added. That's the sector's contribution to GDP. And we see that that is 7 billion. So again, it's a relatively small sector. However, this really belies its importance in the overall economy. So overall, the sector accounts for around 18% of UK GDP in terms of supporting GDP. That's 370 billion. So I don't mean the sector's producing 370 billion GDP. I don't even mean that 370 billion would be wiped out where the sectors disappear. But satellite services play a role in underpinning that and supporting it in the same way that the internet supports lots of economic activity. And within that, we have Earth observation satellites, meteorology, navigation and communications, supporting economic growth, and the most significant of those sectors by far is navigation. And then lastly, I'll finish on a future outlook. So 3 and 5 organisations expected income growth over the next 3 years when we took the survey in late 2021. So it's only 3 and 5, but given the state of the economy at that time and the enormous difficulties, actually that's quite impressive. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. So thank you for a great overview of the landscape. We've clearly got a growth industry here, which is great. And I'd next like to introduce Maureen Haverty. So Maureen is a principal investor at Seraphim. Previously, she was COO at Apollo Fusion, a space startup, and that was sold very successfully. At Apollo, Maureen was responsible for business development, manufacturing, and complex programs. She was also senior director of corporate development at Astra, a rocket launch company listed on NASDAQ. She has a first-class Bachelor of Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University College Cork, and a PhD in Nuclear Engineering from the University of Manchester. Maureen, could you please introduce us to Seraphim, your role at Seraphim, and some of the involvement you have in the space sector?
Thank you very much for having me, Yasmeen. So I'll just really quickly introduce Seraphim Space. So Seraphim is a space specialist venture capital investor. We're headquartered in London, but we invest globally. We've got about $250 million assets under management, and we're listed on the London Stock Exchange. We have 30 portfolio companies that range from seed up to pre-IPO. And when I say we're global, about 40% of our portfolio is based in the US. We have a major investment in Japan in Astroscale, 4 companies in Israel, 1 in India and Pixel, and then the majority of the rest of them are based in Europe. So the number one thing you should know about us is that we're always looking for global category leaders. We don't really care where you come from, as long as you're actually going to be the global winner. Just really quickly, could I get a show of hands as to who here thinks they're pretty familiar with venture capital so that I can pitch my presentation appropriately? Okay. So I think it's probably about half and half. So I think the number one thing to know about venture capital is that we're looking for absolute outlier returns. You know, we promise our investors, up to 100x returns if we're investing early stage and 3 to 5x if we're investing very late stage. And what does a company need to do for us to achieve those returns? It needs to be a massively enormous success. It needs to be the global winner. And what that means in practical terms for a company is we're not just looking for companies that are going to make a lot of money. It's an awful lot of money, an eye-watering amount of money. And I think that drives all of our decisions when we look at a sector and we look at a company. Was it this one? Yeah. Okay, great. So first of all, for anyone who has been I'll just continue clicking. I'm going to go through some good news about the space sector. And I think, first of all, the number one thing I want you to take away from tonight is that space is something where people are making money right now. You'll probably read a lot in the news about the potential of space, about the moon, about space stations, about Mars exploration. And I think that's because they're headline grabbing. But really, how are people making money right now? It originally was providing satellite internet in more remote locations, and obviously Starlink, and I'm sure Kuiper quite soon, and OneWeb are delivering broadband communications. We're going to see increasingly that people will be delivering satellite internet direct to cell. And there's been some changes in the telecommunications standards that allow that. Earth observation with imaging, both for companies and for defense and global security purposes, as well as obviously things like meteorology. So there's a lot of money being made already. Okay, so if you've been following venture capital in the last couple of years, obviously it's been a brutal time because of higher interest rates and a changing risk appetite posture. So that means that globally, general VC was down 35%. The good news for space is it was flat 2022 to 2023. So, that will be a serious success in venture capital. A lot of that was driven, and the trend that we see quarter on quarter is that it looks like 2024 is probably going to be an okay year. Not amazing, but not terrible if that quarterly trajectory continues. Why has space had a good year? The global security environment has really driven investment into defense, and space is very much a core part of that. We've skipped the slide, but also we've seen a lot of growth investment being driven by Japanese corporates. So Mitsubishi, Toyota, Mitsui, Marubeni have participated in some of the largest growth rounds. And why have they done that? Because they're extremely long-term investors. They love hardware, they love manufacturing, and they see where they can provide an advantage here. I've skipped 2 slides. So I mentioned that. That's not working. Okay, yeah, if you just jump back to the revenue. Okay, so as I mentioned, VCs focus on revenue all the time. In deep tech and in space for a number of years, particularly, in the heady days of 2021, we kind of let that requirements slide a bit. We're like, okay, it's space, it's special, it's hardware, it's probably going to take to Series C, so let's say your 3rd or 4th round of investment, before you need to be generating revenue. And in comparison to general VC, the expectation would be absolutely by your 2nd round of investment, you need to be generating, tangible revenue. And what's happened now in the last 2 years in space is like, no, you need to be generating revenue, and no excuses this time. No excuses about you being a hardware company, you being a launch company. You need to find a way to generate revenue now for 2 reasons. First of all, I want you to demonstrate that you can achieve product market fit, that people are interested in buying what you're selling. And second of all, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is I don't want to be putting money into a money pit for several rounds of financing in a high interest rate environment. That's just not an attractive proposition anymore. So this is a quote from from an investor, one of the top 10 investors in the world, traditionally invests in space, has made a lot of money in space. And she has said, absolutely, only investing in revenue generating companies right now. I don't want to look at, I'm not even looking at the deck of any company that isn't generating revenue right now. So that's the environment that companies are operating in. Really challenging for companies. I have a lot of sympathy. On the other hand, it will clearly make healthier companies in the long run if they're like, okay, I can't go out and raise any more money until I've got revenue. So we go on to the next slide. No one wants to be left carrying the can. Another top tier growth investor has said, look, I have a multi-billion-dollar fund, and I know if this company can't raise this next round, everyone around the table is going to go, okay, I need some money from that multi-billion-dollar fund. So what are those really strong investors thinking about? They're thinking about the quality of the investor syndicate. Are they the only big investor with the only big fund around the table? They're thinking about how long it's going to get you to revenue and how much money you need before you get to really substantial revenue. They're thinking about exit horizon a lot more and in a much stricter way. So these are the things that, when you see the investment trends in the headlines, these are what the, internal discussions that are happening amongst VCs. If we move on to the next slide. Okay, so next I want to talk about 3 investments we've made, or 3 of our portfolio companies that we've done in the last year. So this first company, Amini AI, came through our accelerator, and it's a really interesting company based in Africa, based in Kenya actually. And it's based on the idea that Africa is basically where most of the world's commodities are produced, but it is the most data scarce continent. So unlike in the US, where high quality weather information has been provided by the government for probably about 100 years, or in the EU, where agricultural data is collated and collected by governments, that does not exist in Africa by and large. There's very little information provided for free by governments or even by existing companies. So what that means is that companies don't have the information they need to make decisions about their business. What does that mean in practical terms for somewhere like Africa that's producing commodities? Well, Africa produces about $140 billion of cocoa a year. 70% of that is processed in the Netherlands, so falls under EU regulations. EU companies like Mars, like Nestle, like Unilever can't provide the information they need to for the EU. So that's a reporting issue. They can't make decisions about how weather is going to affect their crop and is going to affect how they're going to manufacture things. The cocoa industry, for example, is extremely vulnerable to child labour. They don't know which farms they need to go and audit. So what Amini does is combine satellite data with ground source truth, with AI models, to provide all of that information that has been 13 data streams in one into useful, actionable insights for major suppliers. So that's who they're targeting. Great CEO. She comes from an AI and chip background, Kate Callett. We think she's really going places. Okay, so next slide. This is a much later stage company, Deorbit, who we've been invested in for about for a number of years. So they just raised, it was announced 2 weeks ago, €100 million Series C investment, led by a Japanese corporate, Marubeni. So what do? They are basically providing the space logistics and space infrastructure for companies in space. If you need to get to space, to the right orbit quickly, Deorbit provides that. If you need to communicate with other satellites in space, Deorbit provides that. If you need to process information in space quickly to make decisions, Deorbit provides that. So they're kind of the logistics backbone from space. And then the last slide. So, these pictures have turned out quite poorly. This is Atmos Space. It's a German seed stage company, and they provide return services from space. So there's a lot of actual experiments, manufacturing that we want to happen in space. We need to return it from space, and there's a bottleneck in returning things from space. Why did we invest in Atmos? First of all, really great CEO, really tenacious, served in the German parachute regiment, several tours in Afghanistan, was really on the ball, have their own unique technology coming from his parachute background, which he developed, so their own intellectual property, technically better product than everyone else. And then for me, the most important thing was, whilst self-funded on $100,000 of funding, they were doing things that other companies that I spoke to spent millions on. And I mean, being efficient with your resources, that's what I liked. And the last bit is, with that background, they're planning on launching at the end of this year, 18 months after raising their first seed round, returning from space. I mean, so far, only nation states and SpaceX have done that. So that level of ambition is what we're looking for.
Thank you very much, Maureen. It's a great introduction to the VC world in the space sector. So our third speaker, Julia Astley, is a mission and systems engineer at ClearSpace UK, where she spent the last 2 years working in early stage mission design for projects involving active debris removal, in-orbit refueling, and life extension. So really interesting areas. Prior to joining ClearSpace, Julia worked in satellite operations and systems engineering at OneWeb. She holds an undergraduate degree in physics and maths and a master's in space science and engineering from Swansea University and University College London. So Julia, we have launched a lot of stuff into space, and there's some of it has not come back. Some of it's still floating around, and I know that's what ClearSpace is all about. What are we going to do about this? So could you please share what you're doing at ClearSpace?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you very much, Yasmeen, and thank you to everyone else, for the organisers, for inviting me here today. Tough crowd. You guys did really well. Tough act to follow. Thank you for the introduction. I was going to say a little bit more about myself, but Yasmeen said it probably a little bit better than I was going to. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so when we think about space, often people picture something similar to this, right? So dark, empty, quiet, a little bit mystical. But actually, if you go to the next slide, if you click again, there should be an animation that plays. Thank you. Yeah, so it's not really showing very well here, but this is actually an animation created by the European Space Agency, which shows the density of satellites in Earth's orbit. Okay, I'm not sure this is... So we're kind of zooming through middle Earth orbit right now. All of those little orange dots are satellites, rocket bodies, bits of debris that have been left by other space missions. And we're launching more and more of these objects every year. We're getting to a point where some of our most popular orbits are becoming very crowded. And once they become crowded, it makes it very difficult to run space operations in those orbits efficiently. You spend a lot of time doing things like collision avoidance, you have RF interference, you just have to spend a lot more time doing really your end goal rather than, to do the things to get you to your end goal rather than just focusing on your end goal. So if you go to the next slide, please. And we talk about space debris as a very sort of theoretical or academic problem. It's actually something we've already observed. This video here, again, apologies for the quality. I don't know if anyone managed to catch it. We saw a real-life collision in 2009 between an Iridium satellite and an old Russian telecom satellite. The result of that collision was a lot of new debris created in clouds, again, around very popular orbits. And we still see the impacts of those today. So you can still track, they are trackable a lot of the time, but a lot of them are too small to track. So really, if you're, operating a satellite in these areas, you're kind of blind. You have no idea what's there. You could be flying into something at, 15 kilometers per second velocity, which is obviously very dangerous and can be very destructive to your satellite. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. I think we'll maybe skip this one because I think my quality, the lighting is not great. So if you just go to the next one, please. Okay, and so what is the problem with not looking after space? Like what happens or what's the downside if we just kind of throw all our junk up, we never take anything and we just kind of keep throwing stuff? Well, we have a lot of technology terrestrially that actually very much relies on space. So we've just discussed, by the previous panelists, but things like navigation, TV, disaster monitoring, shipping, communications, internet, all of those things are really heavily reliant on satellites, and particularly satellites in low Earth orbit, which provide the lowest latency but for users on the ground. Okay, so that's my background on space debris. If you'd like to move to the next slide, please, I'll talk to you a little bit about ClearSpace, so the company that I work for, and what we're trying to do about this problem. So a little bit of history. So ClearSpace started up as a very small 5-person startup, spinning out from EPFL in Switzerland in 2017. Somehow, against all odds, they managed to win a major contract with the European Space Agency in 2018, which is really where the scaling up of the business started to happen. So the first project that we were contracted to do is a servicing mission to remove a large piece of debris from low Earth orbit in 2026. The piece of debris we're looking to remove is a payload adapter from an old Vega launcher. Then in the timeline, so I kind of joined in 2021. So I've been heavily involved in the CLEAR mission. So the CLEAR mission is sort of a follow-on, the next stage in active debris removal mission design. It's a mission in partnership with the UK Space Agency. It will basically go and rendezvous and dock with 2 dead satellites that are owned by the UK government. And then we'll accelerate their decomposition orbits by up to 90%. So kind of going to clean things up a little bit, and then also is designed to be refuelable, which again is another key part of sustainable space operations. Later on, you can see here, I've got at the end the Encore mission kickoff. So this mission is a little bit different. So up until that point, most of the projects had been focused on low Earth orbit and active debris removal of satellites that were no longer in use or debris objects. But Encore is actually focused on providing an in-orbit service to a currently in-use satellite. So there are satellites in geostationary orbit, which are very, very expensive, hundreds of millions to build, and they last typically 10 to 15 years lifetime. Often they get to the end of that lifetime and they're still operational, their payloads still work, they're still able to provide a service, but the one limiting factor they have is that they've run out of fuel. And when they're out of fuel, they're no longer able to maintain their orbital position. And that means that the service becomes degraded and they can't meet their commitments to their customers. So what we're essentially providing as a service is a life extension, which involves us going and taking over the driving for a period of time. So that the end customer and the owner of the satellite can continue to extract revenue from that satellite at the end of its design life. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. So here is a little bit more about the missions I just spoke to you about. I think the key thing I'd like to emphasize here is that ClearSpace is an in-orbit services company. So a lot of companies are only involved in maybe hardware design, or they provide a small element or a subsystem. We're actually mainly interested in contracting with institutional and commercial customers to provide an end-to-end service where we design, build, operate, and do the whole thing end-to-end. The core technologies that we focus on developing and to enable those services I've described are things like visual-based navigation, very advanced guidance navigation and control algorithms using neural networks, advanced robotics. I've already touched on refueling. So those are the core competencies that really set ClearSpace apart from a normal satellite company or one that's just building an everyday satellite. And that's what kind of enables our business model. Okay, if you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. This is just a little animation to kind of show you some of those core technologies in action that I've just described. It's not very visible, but what you're seeing here is an interpretation of a ClearSpace servicing satellite performing a very, very slow and controlled hug of a debris object. So something that maybe not everyone is aware of is that in low Earth orbit, we're traveling at speeds for around 7.5 kilometers per second. It's incredibly fast. So in order to get that close and capture essentially an object at that speed, you have to perform the relative motion very, very slowly and very, very gently to avoid creating any more debris objects, because these objects have been degraded by radiation over time. They've been in the space environment. And so, yeah, everything is done in a very, very careful, controlled and slow manner. Next slide, please. And here's an animation just to kind of give a little bit more background about the UK debris removal mission. So you have an animation of what the service is planned to look like here. What makes this mission really special is that it's designed to be reusable and refurbishable itself. So it will, launch, dock, and deorbit 2 separate dead satellites. It will then hopefully be refueled, and then be able to go on and remove further dead, like debris objects or defunct satellites from orbit. Okay. And here's just a little graphic to show kind of the orbital motion of what's planned for the servicer. Okay, and move it to the next slide, please. Yeah, that's everything from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow, I personally find that incredible that you can have something so far away performing incredible fixes and removal. We have a time for questions and answers here. Before I turn to the floor for question and answers, I wondered if you could each just share with us what attracted you to the space sector. Eloise, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a background in economics. I studied at uni and I thought, okay, I want to be an economist, but I didn't think I'm going to be a space economist. I had an interest in space, since childhood. It was always something that fascinated me, but I thought it would be a hobby. And I was lucky enough to literally come across a job advert and I thought this is the perfect job for me. I applied and here we are.
Okay.
So I completely accidentally fell into space. I had no interest in space. I was working in a startup as a nuclear engineer and we became a space company on Friday evening, walked into a space company on Monday morning, and here I am. But I guess why did I stay in space and didn't try to move back into nuclear? Whilst I love the science of nuclear, it's a really slow-moving industry, whereas space going through this massive disruption, all of these startups being founded, growing, going under, the number of constellations growing up has just been a really dynamic and exciting industry to be in, and that's why I've stayed.
I guess for me, I was always very interested in space. It was something that I thought was a dream, wasn't something that would be feasible for me. So I studied maths and physics, and it was only really at the end of my undergraduate degree did I really become aware of the private space industry within the UK. In my mind, it was always something that was NASA or America or something really far-flung that was never really within my reach. And so, when I found it out, I was like, yep, that's it. That's all I want to do. And I think for me, I've always had a real interest in sustainability. So after finishing university, I worked at Tesla for a little while. And so for me, kind of being able to marry sustainability and my passion for space together is something like ClearSpace is really exciting.
Oh, okay. Thanks very much for that. So do we have some questions for the panel? Please. Oh, do you want to just wait for the microphone because we're recording this? And it's great to get the clear audio. Thank you.
Thanks. It's for our ClearSpace guest. Can you talk us through how you're going to take these big British-owned objects out of space? Are you going to bring them back to the UK? I mean, how's that going to work? Is it not going to burn up on entry, or?
Yeah. So the objects we're planning on removing with the reusable surface admission design are objects that are quite small and are already slated for an uncontrolled burn up in the atmosphere anyway. So essentially, if we leave them where they are right now, they will take 50 to 150 years before they re-enter the atmosphere. What we're doing is going and bringing them down into a much lower orbit, which will decay naturally and much faster. So yes, we can't target the UK, and they shouldn't have any pieces that land on the ground, but there is a small chance.
Okay, just another follow-up one. I've understood that there's a lot of gold in satellites. Is that right? In the manufacturing of satellites? Not a lot of gold?
I'm not sure there's enough to make it worth retrieving. I think that's the...
Any other questions? Well, I've got a question again about the retrieval. Who's paying for it? Who's paying for it? I mean, and why that piece, and how big is that piece that's being brought back?
So it varies. At the moment, there is no requirement for an owner of a satellite that has been launched, prior to, say, 2020 or 2015 to really care as such. They were designed and built at a time where we weren't as concerned about debris, the effects of debris, and maintaining the space environment. Going forward, I think the proposition is that regulations might change. We saw last year that the FAA in America changed the regulations so that the end of life of the satellites, they must deorbit within 5 years instead of 25 years. And so in situations like that, we would be assisting companies or owners of satellites where they might not, legally have to do something, but they might feel that their liability if they don't do something is quite high.
Sean. Oh, can we just get the microphone? Sorry about that.
Thank you. I have a question around data and sustainability, because I know those are two things that you've mentioned across the board. What is the space industry or the companies that have been mentioned today doing around data, and how can you enable other companies with security in data?
Sorry, could you clarify exactly what you mean about data and security around data?
Yeah, so some of the data that you're picking up in the space industry is pretty much gold. How can you enable other companies to use that data to support, for example, analytics or sustainability across other industries?
Well, so first of all, there are a number of government satellites. The EU has some, the US has some that provide data for free for a wide number of purposes. And then the new generation of commercial Earth observation companies, which I think is what you're referring to, so who take pictures of the Earth, they sell those. And they also provide them to free to NGOs and charity or a very reduced cost. So it's, space data is highly accessible. One of the interesting things is the faster you want it, the more immediately you want the information from when it was taken, you will pay a much higher premium versus, a lot of companies will release some of their archive data from maybe 2 years ago for NGOs for free. So it's a completely tradable commodity. And in fact, there are many startups that are never going to launch their own satellites who just buy the data and use it and build a product around that. And they're very interesting.
If I could just add to that. So I think ESA, the European Space Agency, and NASA, they also run programs whereby they procure commercial data and then they don't just buy it, they also kind of integrate it so it can all be used on one platform and, importantly, used together.
Okay, the microphone's out there. Maybe we could pass it to someone else out there, if you wouldn't mind.
Do you have any thoughts about the sustainability of the current number of LEOs, particularly ones used potentially for communications, in terms of the number of LEOs and also actually whether or not there's a market for LEOs and broadband over LEOs?
As in, do you mean the economic sustainability?
I mean both sorts of sustainability. The number that are actually in orbit now, and obviously it's going to increase with the number of new launches coming up, but also the economic sustainability.
Okay, so just to clarify, first of all, the launching of anything into space is an incredibly regulated industry. Don't believe anyone who tells you it's not. You both have to get safety for during launch with the FAA in the US because you're launching with SpaceX. And if you're not launching with SpaceX, you probably should be because it's much cheaper. But if you're not launching with SpaceX, you have to pass safety regulations elsewhere. And then you basically have to get regulation from the FCC or an equivalent internationally to be in space. And that will include what you're going to do with your end of life. So it's now reduced to 5 years. You're responsible for ensuring you don't crash into anything. So that's highly regulated. And then you're tracked all the time by both the US Air Force and by commercial companies to see where you are to prevent you interacting with anyone. So it's highly regulated. Any company who's launching a large number of satellites has to demonstrate that they're going to be safe, and takes way in excess of those measures are required to actually get a license to launch. To be totally clear, the FCC can deny your license for any reason it wants to. It doesn't need to provide a reason. It can delay giving you a license. I've been on the unfortunate position there. So if they think that you're going to be a danger to others and the LEO environment, they will certainly stop you. And the US is really the leader in this because they have the most US commercial satellites in LEO and defense satellites in LEO. They're highly reliant on it, so they take it very seriously. In terms of financially sustainable, I mean, SpaceX with Starlink, it's profitable. The talk really is when it's going to IPO. I mean, and the question is it delayed in IPOing because the markets are closed? Probably. It's providing a great service. There's high demand for it, and it looks like the second generation of satellites will offer an even greater benefit, and they're rolling out direct to cell with that. Kuiper, I think, has a lot of Amazon Kuiper's constellation has a lot of integrations potentially with AWS that could be quite differentiated. I guess the question is whether there's room for many other constellations, and I think it's can you offer a different product and at a price point that people want. And I think that's probably the challenge as far as I can see.
Hello. No, I'm sat behind the tallest person in the room. With the best beard as well. My pleasure. A little bit of a self-indulgent question. I'm with a tech PR and marketing consultancy. I'm a massive geek and I love SpaceTech to the point where I went and saw a friend of mine about 5 years ago working for the UK satellite catapult and asked whether it was time that we should start a SpaceTech division, and she said no. Don't go anywhere near it. So I'm here today. We saw that, we learned earlier that ancillary services account for 4% of the total sector spend, which is nice. It's actually a nice, polite way of describing PR people, ancillary services. What's your expectation of the marketing requirement around this sector? Do you expect spend to increase? Is there a requirement for demand generation? And are our hosts placing CMOs and business development leads, or is it mostly focused around financial and technology? That was a lot of questions, sorry.
So firstly, I can't remember the stats off the top of my head for how every segment is expected to grow. But if you look in the Size and Health report online, we do have a breakdown by segment. In general, there's growth across the board. We rarely see actual decline. If anything, it's decline relative to other segments. In terms of those ancillary services, I think particularly in the UK, actually, we see lots of growth in areas like space law. For example, Northumbria Uni having a strong specialism there. Space insurance is also a growing area. And also, obviously, within the financial services sector, we'd also include that within the ancillary services segment. There's a lot going on. But there's also growth in kind of analytics side of things in particular. So particularly on government side, there's increasing interest in showing returns, improving that money is being spent well. So a lot of the time that means economists, but there's also work for kind of strategy type professionals there too.
So it's more than marketing. Yeah.
Substantially more.
First of all, thank you so much for the fantastic panel. I have a kind of a question in regards to the state of space portrayed in potentially probably popular media. I think specifically when we look at people like Elon Musk, Bezos, the Virgin Group, they're really targeting, for what I can tell, space tourism. And so I was just wondering, in the VC ecosystem, is that same enthusiasm reflected? And as a second point, and a second question is, if not, what are some specific space tech subsegments that particularly excite people within the VC space? Happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that Elon in particular has been amazing at creating what I would call Mars fundamentalists and bringing them along and like paying them less than the market rate to work at SpaceX. I think personally that his big interest is making a lot of money, and he's making a lot of money with Starlink, and he's making a lot of money with SpaceX. I don't really think it's a space tourism thing at all. And absolutely, VCs are not interested in space tourism. Why? Because we're interested in making a lot of money, and there aren't ever going to be enough people who can afford to go to space for us to make a lot of money. So it's really all the things that he's doing to supposedly fund the colonization of Mars that we're really interested in. So what excites us right now? I think that communications from space, unfortunately, we've got a really exciting investment into a company that's doing direct to cell from space, and obviously be really appropriate to tell this forum about it, but it's not publicly announced yet. But we're really excited by the potential of that. We're really excited by companies that are building products around space data without any satellites themselves. So another recent investment that I didn't include here was Delos. They're a California-based company who make radically improved wildfire models using space data, and then they use those models to find homes and properties that others won't insure, that they have actually determined are low risk. And that is a multi-billion-dollar wildfire insurance market just in the state of California alone, and they can expand that globally. So those kind of companies where it's massively enabled by space, they can go to market quite quickly. They're very exciting, as well as obviously the 3 companies that I introduced, I think, demonstrate the kind of things that we're interested in and VCs are interested in.
Thank you.
So is there any scope in reusing these deorbited satellites, or are there any future plans at ClearSpace to do so?
Sorry, will you repeat the question, please? I didn't.
Is there any scope of reusing these deorbited satellites, and is there any future plans at ClearSpace to do so?
No plans at ClearSpace. I think there have been studies, people looking at dragging, I say dragging, that's a rather inelegant way of describing it, people transferring old disused satellites or rocket bodies that are around Earth orbit, maybe towards lunar orbit, looking at using that in a way, but nothing at ClearSpace at this time.
We had a question at the front here with Sean. Do we have you have a question? Why don't you ask your question while you're there?
Okay. Hi, my name is Dipali, and I work with BDO, and we help UK tech companies get some growth and innovation funding. So my question is UK able to sustain the kind of demand that this industry has in terms of skill set, or are you dependent on outsourcing from other nations?
Yeah, I think I'm quite well placed to answer this one. So know.space quite recently delivered a report with the Space Skills Alliance called the Space Skills Survey for the UK Space Agency. And one of the key themes of that report was skills shortages, kind of across the board, particularly for those technical roles. Find people go into space because it's really interesting work, space is fun, but actually the wages are often unable to compete with other sectors where people with those really niche engineering and technical skills could choose to work.
So it's engineering skills in particular?
Yeah, engineering skills are often pointed out, but also kind of computer skills, coding skills, stuff like that.
Thank you. I had a question for Julia. I'm fascinated about the idea of extending the life of geostationary satellites. I was trying to work out if you're sending up a tow truck or a fuel tanker. Are you topping them up, or are you attaching and driving them?
Without giving too much away, maybe a mix of both.
Oh, that's not
but
fair.
not exactly in those configurations that you're imagining. I'm trying not to be too mystical, but I'm also very aware that I can't give too much away. I'm sorry. I would say that for now, the missions that I referenced, it's kind of more, I wouldn't say a tow truck, because we're kind of, I'm trying to think of a better analogy.
Tractor beam.
Yeah, a forklift.
A forklift, right.
They're on the front rather than the back. That's the
I have a few on the VC side. So how hard is it to raise a fund for space tech? Who are your LPs? And also, do you see a growing secondaries market kind of over the course of this year?
So we're listed on the London Stock Exchange, which means that we're publicly listed. So it's public shareholders. And I actually was not in the business at the time, so I can't really speak to how challenging it was. But I think in general, raising for an investment trust right now is quite challenging with the reduced share prices of all the investment trusts. I think in general, it is extremely challenging for venture capital funds to raise at the moment. very briefly, with a high interest rate environment, there's no need to chase risky investments to go after, which you normally would go for in VC. So that makes it really challenging. And I think there's definitely going to be a culling, maybe particularly of smaller venture funds and maybe more local funds. But we'll see that globally. And I think it is going to be a very challenging year. And I think that is something that could affect, and I didn't touch on it too much, that 2024 is probably not going to be an amazing year because just there's generally less venture funding floating around. Do I think there's going to be a large secondaries market? I think maybe we've seen some secondaries funds. So secondaries is where you buy the shares off existing investors, and you buy it usually at a discount, and you buy it for companies that you think, like, this is a great company. Why would someone sell their shares if they think it's a great company and there's still returns left to be made? Because they want to return liquidity, they want to return cash to their own investors, or they want to recycle it back into the fund so they can continue investing. So there's a lot of push from existing investors to cash out. And then with the decrease in valuations that you're seeing across the board in startups, there's some good deals to be made. So it's definitely happening in general VC. I haven't seen it specifically so much in space. I guess one thing is that one of the challenges that VCs have to think about is, do you then scare the market about that company that you're invested in? So you can partially sell, and the ethics of doing it, if you would damage the company's ability to raise money afterwards. So it's a very challenging thing to do.
I just had a question about when you're launching things into space nowadays. Do you have to pay as part of your cost, making sure that it exits?
Not necessarily making sure that it exits, but there are, as Maureen was saying, there are very, very tight regulations with being given the permission to launch and then permission to operate. And all of those will have international agreements underpinning them on, agreed standards of how we want to behave in space. So that would include the exiting of the satellite from its orbital slot and hopefully being placed in an orbit that's not dangerous to others within a certain time frame.
Okay, so it could just stay up there forever. It just goes into a different orbit there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, any more questions from anybody before we close? Okay, well, I just want to take a minute to thank our panel for their insights this evening. I think it's been quite interesting, certainly piqued my interest in the industry about finding out more. And we've covered quite a range of topics, so I hope everybody will stay on to continue the discussion afterwards. Just want to give a thank you. Yeah. Thanks very much.